What's up, Gutter Gang? This is a special presentation of joint programming brought to you by the Autoptic 2020 Festival and the Gutter Boys podcast.
Follow Autoptic on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and visit autoptic.org to keep up with our plans for the 2021 show. That's AUTOPTIC.org.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this digital edition of the Autoptic Festival. My name is Robert James Algeo. In addition to being a founder of the Autoptic Foundation, I am also an assistant professor of comics at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. For those of you who might not know, Autoptic is a Twin Cities-based arts festival focusing on comics, zines, and print media. Basically, the big idea is we wanted to have a festival where artists were able to connect with their audience with things that they made. So a print media, stuff that you could kind of actually hold. It's a biennial festival that we've done 3 times in the past. For obvious reasons, we won't be meeting in person this year, and so that's why we're doing some of these digital initiatives with panels and conversations and interviews. And I'm thrilled today to be joined by 2 guests. I'm here with Whitney Leopard. She is the senior editor at Random House Graphic, a graphic novel imprint that focuses on stories for kids and young adults. She previously ran the Kaboom imprint at Boom Studios before making the jump to New York City to work at Penguin Random House. And I'm also joined today by Jose Pimienta, a Latinx cartoonist from Mexicali, Mexico. They have had the privilege of illustrating with amazing authors for books The Leg, Soupy Leaves Home, and From Scratch. Currently, they are illustrating their own stories. Jose's graphic novel, which we'll kind of be talking about today, is Suncatcher, available now through Random House Graphics. So, Whitney, Jose, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah,
thank you for having us. Yeah.
With this digital initiative with Autoptic, we set up cartoonist interviews, sort of one-on-one. This conversation is a little bit different, where we have kind of 2 people with a very specific creative relationship, that of author and editor. I think our goal today is to sort of have a conversation and hear from the 2 of you about the nature of that relationship. How do you take an idea? How does it move from idea head space to creative space to published space? Hopefully not too many challenges to discuss, but I thought an interesting place to start would actually be with a question for Whitney. Whitney, are you comfortable and able to recall what were your first impressions of Suncatcher? When did you first hear about it? When did you come to know the work? And how did that process start from your perspective?
So the process for, I guess, Suncatcher coming to Random House Graphics started with me and Jose have known each other for many years, and I have been a huge fan of their work, and I have followed all the books that they've done, and it's just been really exciting to get to see the work that they've done over the years. And when I was working at Kaboom, like a lot of the stuff that I worked on was very licensed and like focused on Cartoon Network properties, and there just wasn't necessarily a world in which I got to work with people on their original titles. And then when I got to go to Random House Graphic, I was like, finally, I get to work with people on original titles, and I get to work with creators who I've been, kind of stalking, kind of friends with. It's a pseudo mix that I feel like editorial kind of falls into, because we always want, like, we want to be everyone's friend, but we also want to work with them professionally. So that kind of, and it's a fun space to be in. And so for Suncatcher specifically, it was actually something that I had already talked to Jose about before, because Jose ran it as a Kickstarter. And so it was something that, like, Jose, tell me if I'm like incorrect here, because I don't want to like assume, but it was something that you were like super excited about, and I got to see early stages of it whenever Jose was putting it together as a Kickstarter. And then so whenever I came to Random House Graphic and we were looking for books that we wanted to bring, and I was just like, what book would be perfect for the for the book market that we don't have anything like in the book market, and is something that is also already done, and it was self-published through Kickstarter, because whenever we started the imprint, we kind of hit the ground running, and we needed some material that was already finished, because we couldn't ask someone to do a graphic novel in 6 months.
You could. That was
Well, we didn't want to. I actually brought, I had like the PDF of Suncatcher, and I brought it to work, and I showed it to Gina, and I showed it to Patrick, who are the two other people I work with at Random House Graphic, and they were just as excited, and we were able to then talk to Jose about bringing it over to our imprint.
So, Jose, does that sound right to your recollection?
Yeah, the first thing that I want to point out is that I'm glad that I wasn't the only one stocking, because that is definitely one thing that is like exactly as Whitney said. Like it's comics it's technically a bit of a smallish community in terms of an industry, so you end up making friends with people that you also have to and want to be professional with, but like you want to work with them and all these things. Like that's pretty much where it was. That's pretty much how that came about. I mean, Whitney and I had known each other for a few years, and like I was always a big fan of like whenever we would get to hang out, it was always just exciting to hear her talk because she had these very, very interesting perspectives on story and storytelling. I was like, and we had talked a couple of times just socially about wanting to collaborate, on projects at some point. But as Whitney mentioned, she was working on licensed work. I wasn't entirely sure where I wanted to have my footing because even to this point, like I'm still discovering my voice as a writer, so I wasn't really sure what kind of stories I wanted to be telling. Suncatcher in and of itself, when it first started, it had one of the biggest pitfalls I would say that a lot of creator-owned people have, which is I want this book to be for everybody, and it doesn't have a market, and it's just for anyone can read it, from 5-year-olds to 59-year-olds. Like, well, no. As the process went on, and as I started to focus on my own writing, eventually I found the quote-unquote market that I could hit, and thanks to Whitney, it was also doable now. So yeah.
Jose, you sort of talked a little bit a second ago about how, you described it as a pitfall of Suncatcher, but having, read the book this weekend, to me, it seemed to do a pretty good job of having a pretty focused environment, a pretty focused sort of sense of place and character. For people listening who haven't read it yet, it focuses on a young woman named Beatrix who is sort of navigating the independent rock and roll scene in Mexicali in the late 90s and early 2000s, which, while not on the Mexican side of the border, very much mirrored my life in the late 90s. So I think a lot of detail there to feel very, real, which is sort of a long way of saying, even though to me it had that specific sense of place and character, the themes, I would agree with what you were saying, Jose, were pretty broad and encompassing and something that a lot of people could get into. And Whitney, you mentioned a moment ago that you felt Suncatcher was doing something that I think you said it's something that you didn't have on the market yet, or it was different from material. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit? Like, what specifically about this book was that different thing?
I mean, it's kind of like what you just mentioned earlier, where you're like, it resonated with you despite the fact that you did not live on the other, like in Mexicali. And it was one of those things where like it was such a specific point in time where the story takes place, but the story itself resonates that I think with like such a drastic readership that like it can reach so many different people. And I feel like in some ways graphic novels, they all have, not that they all have to, but they all tend to take place in nondescript middle town, like small town America. And it's like this small aspect of, yes, it's the, the TV show Random City that everyone can kind of relate to, and everything kind of all looks the same. And it was one of those things where like one of the things that resonated with me with Suncatcher was like, I grew up in small college town Texas, and I was just like, but I still feel like I know this town, I know the people in this town. And to me, it showed that you can take a very specific setting and you can show how worldwide that experience is, even though it's a very specific setting. And then just also having the characters. I love the story. It's one of those things. It's like, I love the characters. I love the story. There was this great balance of thematics throughout the story, where it's just one of those things where there's so many scenes that like are very powerful, but it's not necessarily character focused. It's not like a close up on a panel of a character's face. It could be like the scenery as the characters go by, because what's most powerful is the aftermath of a scene that just happened. And I felt like that was something that resonated with me as a reader whenever I was going over the book.
Yeah, I think that was sort of my impression as well. It feels to me, Whitney, what you're talking about are maybe some of those wonderful spreads where there's, all those different like aspect to aspect shot transitions of the rehearsal space, or we see the amps, the pedals, the instruments, the physicality of playing. And it sounds dumb, but it's like just seeing people from another country using the same guitar pedals you use, it like locks you in. Like, oh yeah, I guess we are all right. So I have another question. So Whitney, some of the stuff that you just described about development of theme, development of idea, and you didn't use these words, but a little bit of that like authorial voice. Mm-hmm. I think most people listening probably have this idea that an editor works to kind of help shape that or guide that. But Suncatcher, if I'm understanding correctly, is sort of arrived at Random House more or less fully formed. I assume there was some changes that happened. I mean, would either of you be comfortable kind of speaking to that part of the process? What happens when a Kickstarter passion project, Jose, I think you wrote, you spent, over a decade kind of forming some of these ideas and things like that. This is a big, heavy thing. What's that process of that handover is maybe not the right word, but that transfer of like, I'm now entrusting these editors and this publisher to show the world this work?
I will add, though, I would like to suggest the word additive. What did you want to talk about this one, or like, so as you were saying, like it's the thing with Suncatcher is that it took a very long time, because again, like in the meantime, both learning how to write, but also working in other projects, while working on this was pretty much the time that it took to make the story come to what it is now. And like by the time that it hit the Kickstarter, it was something that I was very proud of, and it was almost there. But thanks to Whitney, when I when I showed her a pass at it, which just before we sent it to print, she gave me like some very good suggestions, just in terms of like either copy editing or like just like some phrasings here and there, some grammar stuff, because surprising no one, like English is my second language. But when she expressed interest in buying the property, which was like one of the happiest things ever, because A, I get to work with Whitney, and B, Random House. One of the things that we started talking about is just how to even tighten up the story just a little bit more. And nothing about that was a compromise to the story. Everything was just an additional thing to make the story even tighter and better. And without giving any spoilers about it, like some of the additions that happened there were pacing things. I'll take the fall on this one. Some fact-checking things. Just like minute things that don't have anything to do with the plot, that are just like some of the fun things that I like to throw in as Easter eggs. Just that dimensionality was definitely something that the story definitely benefited from. Just in terms of like the clearest example that I think of is when she said, "Hey, in page X, Beatrix goes from 0 to 100. Like, I think it'd be better if we have a couple of pages just to show that build up a little bit more." And it's a scene where Beatrix is playing a Telecaster. Not that matters, but to me it does. But yeah, like I thought that was a great addition of like, let's let it build up a little bit. And there are other moments like that. So that also just goes to show the benefit of having a good editor on your side, is to just look over and be both supportive of what you're doing, but also help you take it to the next level, which is,
I would say that this was probably more of like a special circumstance that doesn't happen always when it comes to like the editorial creator relationship, because this is, like Jose mentioned, I got a chance to see a PDF of it before they sent it to print for the Kickstarter version. And so then like I was able to give like some feedback there. At that point, I already like I saw the story. I loved the story. I was just like, I wish I had published the story. And then I got to like, a few months later be like, and now I maybe can publish the story. So it's one of those things where getting to talk to Jose and getting to work with them on being like, okay, well, like I know I had these notes for the Kickstarter, but these are now additional notes that I have for us bringing it to the book market. And a lot of it was, and it was nothing like Jose mentioned, it was nothing that actually changed the story. It was just like, hey, now that we actually have the chance to add stuff to fine tune this, to the job of an editor, regardless if it's something that already exists or is a brand new from scratch project, I believe the job of an editor is to help make the best version of that book possible. And so I got to use those muscles for something that already existed and it was already great. And then I just got to like work with Jose to be like, but can we make this better? And I think, but no matter what, it stayed the same. Like the story, the messaging, everything behind it, the heart was still there.
Yeah.
And so that was a really fun experience. But it is drastically, which I'm sure Jose, you can also kind of talk. It's drastically different than working from scratch on a project, which we're currently working on a new project together from scratch, but we can't really talk about that one yet.
Oh no, please do, by all means.
This is one of the fun things about and I think I mentioned earlier, I love working with Whitney, but I also love Whitney as my friend, where we can just talk about we can just go back and forth on so many things. Like the relationship is not always professional. So right now we can just be talking about Suncatcher, but it's like, hey, you know that other project? Was like, well, yeah, and I. Just to shed a little bit of light on it without really talking too much about it, it's also a dream project. It's also a dream come true, and it's also a project that I feel very fortunate to have Whitney as my editor on it. Starting from the very bottom and just building it up all the way from script to thumbnails has been pretty much the ideal situation for me. Because I'm the kind of person who appreciates very hands-on kind of input without necessarily being micromanaged in any way, but it's having someone who I can rely on and who I can trust and guidance onto, as you mentioned earlier, to take it from something that I fully believe in to make it even better, and just engaging in those conversations has been just wonderful.
I'd like to ask. I'd like to maybe kind of tease this part out a little bit more from a creative perspective. You've done a variety of different types of creative work, and you just spoke to how you are, now in the midst of this dramatically different kind of gestation process for this new project. Creatively, what does having an editor involved earlier in the project do for you in terms of your process, in terms of the way you think about your work? Is it just that there's another set of eyes catching things you miss, or does it change the way you actually go about doing the creative work?
It's down.
The extra set of eyes is definitely a big benefit, but no, it's absolutely more than that. So I guess it depends on the kind of writer that you are, and it depends on the collaborations that you look for. I guess for me, the benefit has been that the way that I like to work, I'm very much under the philosophy that the smaller the problem, the easier the solution. The small problems require small fixes versus big problems, and so on and so forth. So, for instance, in the when we were working on Suncatcher, by that point, the book is done. It was out. A version or an edition was already in print. All the suggestions and all the notes that Whitney was giving at that point, most of them were pretty much on the side of I can't go back and redo 40 pages of the third act. I can't really. Even when I would get the crazy idea of maybe this character should have been playing a different instrument. It's I'm not going to go back and but in that sense, the benefit for me of editorial it's that, not to sound like a salesperson about it, but it's working with someone who shares the idea and shares the vision of the story, regardless of the beginning, middle, and end part or the technicalities of it, but just someone who understands what you're trying to accomplish and what the overall concept is. And that's pretty big for me, because again, as part of my writing process, I don't usually focus too much on plot. I focus more on what's the overall. So when I start drafting either an outline or a synopsis, at this point we're talking about a few paragraphs that it's way easier to fix, as opposed to showing up with 50 pages of a script and be like, hey, you're gonna need to change this, or maybe I'm not liking this character, or maybe you need to tweak this. So the benefit of having an editor from the ground up is that you have someone who looks at your 5 sentences or your outlines yeah, but this doesn't make sense, or maybe this is inappropriate, or this is reading more like an adult book rather than a children's book, which is, again, something that, not to go back too much to this, but some of the first drafts of Suncatcher, I think my idea or my vision at the time was it was for college kids, and it was going to be about all these things happening and all these new behaviors. the more I kept working on it, I was like, no, this actually has a better appeal if it's for teenagers. So let's reduce some of these activities. Let's tone down some of these things. And in the end, I think that made that story better. And on this other project that Whitney and I are working on right now, it was very much a conversation that we had from the very beginning of like, how are we going to shape this? Like, how do we nail down the tone in order to move forward? And because we were on literally the same letter from the very get-go, it has been a breeze to collaborate on that. So that way, when Whitney has a suggestion or a note to improve the story, then I can just go, but does that go against the story? Does that go against the theme? And I feel comfortable bringing that up. I'm like, I'm not sure about this. And Whitney will either give me a very well-founded argument for like why her idea is better, or what's even great is like she will listen to what I have to say and be like, okay, well, let me think about that, and we'll be like, okay, well, then we can collaborate on that. And that's, again, it doesn't get any better than that to me.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, that's kind of the heart of what I believe a good comic editor is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a collaborator. Like, comics is such a creative medium. It is something that, people pour their heart and soul into, and it takes so long, especially graphic novels take so long. And it's one of those things where, like, as an editor, I feel like it's not meant for me. My job is not meant to go to Jose and be like, hey, you have to do A, B, and C, and it has to be this way, and you have to draw it this way, because then it's no longer Jose's story. And the whole point of my excitement of working with Jose is that Jose gets to tell their stories and gets to do things their way. And so it's my job to be a collaborator, to be like, okay, we're on the same page with the vision. We're on the same page with the goals with the story. So I'm going to take these other perspectives that you as a creator don't have to think about, but I, as like someone who works for a publisher, do have to think about. And we're going to work together in a collaboration to still make your story, but within consideration of how can we make this the most successful story while staying true to the heart that you want to.
Everything that you both just said makes a lot of sense to me. That balance between, I think what Jose sort of described as like the overall vision versus the like, is what they're putting on the page concretely serving the journey to that vision and execution. And so that makes a lot of sense. Something that you just said seemed to echo a little bit something you'd said earlier. And I have a question here. You seemed sorry, that sounded as if I was accusing you of lying. You were obviously very enamored with Suncatcher in that early form, that the self-published Kickstarter form. And so I guess I have sort of like a small question and then maybe a bigger question, and maybe I'll ask them both, and you can decide how you want to kind of tackle it. Do you believe that there are differences between what a comic's content should be like if it is a self-financed, self-published book versus something that is brought to what you called and others called the book market? Like, are there fundamental differences there? And then sort of maybe like a bigger question is, why purchase and publish a book that already exists, that the audience would already have access to? I think I would be very interested to sort of hear your perspective on that.
I feel like for the first question, whether or not there should be something different between something that's more self-published versus something that it goes through like a publisher, I think innately there are differences, and a lot of that just comes from the fact that, like, working with a publisher, you tend to have more resources, such as an editor, such as a marketing team, such as sales team, and all the people who can like help make sure your book gets into more places. Whereas when you self-publish, it's so it's all up to you, and so it tends to be a smaller reach, just by the mere fact that you're not a company. And so like I feel like that's like an innate difference. But when it actually comes to like the content, myself, I don't believe that there should really be a difference, as long as it's something like Suncatcher, which I thought was like this. I think this book is great, and this kind of goes into the second question, where it's like this book I thought was great, but I also understood that if this is a Kickstarter and this is like, this is Jose's dream project, and they're bringing it out to like the market that they can bring it out to. But I could get it to a larger audience if I'm able to take it to this book publisher, because I have the resources, I'll have the marketing team, I have the people behind it. And so that was kind of one of the things where, like, I know that there's a ton of, at the end of the day, there's a ton of self-published works where I'm like, I wish that this had a much wider audience than like the 500 copies that they printed, or the, if it's like SBX, like the 200 zines that they folded and stapled and put together and were like handing out, that you can't necessarily do whenever a big published like Penguin Random House is like sitting here going like, so we're going to print like 10,000, like that's what you said, right? Like 200, what? Like that's too small. There are differences, but I think when it comes to the stories that you want to tell, there's a lot of stuff that come from the self-publishing and come from the more personalized stories that I actually want to see more of in the book market, because I feel like for a while, and you can't blame companies for doing this. They focus more on like, oh well, so this book was commercial, so let's make our version of this book, and then certain stories kind of get watered down. Whereas I feel like when it comes to people self-publishing, they're telling these stories from their heart, and they're telling like their dream stories.
Jose, not to ask if you agree, but I'd be curious to hear, do you view Suncatcher, the Kickstarter edition versus the Random House edition, are they two different books in your mind, or are they like substantially different, or is it just that they kind of exist on like a continuum, and one kind of blends into the other, if that makes sense?
I mean, just to stay on topic about it, like I can't really talk about this without just mentioning like the honor and the privilege that it is to have your dream project picked up by a major publisher. Like that's high recognition right there. But I mean,
no one's asking you to diminish Random House.
Random House will be fine.
Like it's I guess just to stay on topic about it, like it's kind of like when a band does a demo and then they get picked up by by a record company. Like it's I'm sure Green Day has something to say about their record for Kerplunk and the previous demos that they had done. Just to give an example. But you can ask a lot of musicians who have had experiences like that, as well as I'm pretty sure you can talk to other cartoonists of like, how do you tell, like, do you feel that there's a difference between the project that you were in charge of? Because also, even for the Kickstarter edition, I had multiple people helping me, which, that's also, talk about feeling humbled and grateful. But in my mind, I mean, the Kickstarter edition that I did is one that I'm proud of. It's just, in both editions, they're the same story. Like, it's the Random House edition has a few more pages for sure, and it's on a hardcover. You can't really. I don't know if I don't know if that's if I want to make that the Kickstarter edition is also the one that it's the one that I take to conventions. It's the one that it's the one that I look at, and it's the one that kind of resonates into tells me, whenever I look at it, it's like, oh yeah, it's all those years of work. But then there's also this crowning achievement of seeing a hardcover in websites and in bookstores of oh yeah, it was the next step, and it gets me a teary-eyed. But as far as no, they're not drastically different if you want to consider them as far as the content in terms of pages that they have, or even the acknowledgments, or the long list of Easter eggs, which that was the whole process. But other than that, they're relatively the same story. They're just there's just a difference in terms of the production that kind of goes into it. So yeah, I think that the analogy of this was your demo tape, and this is your actual mastered CD. Do you remember CDs?
Yeah, I vaguely. I had another question here. The reason why I'm interested in this is I teach comics at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and while not the same thing as being an editor, there's some overlap and similarity in the sense that students will often bring comics either sort of in the middle of the process, or maybe they bring in these finished pages, and we're expected to critique, and I think, Whitney, what you kind of said earlier is help them develop the best version of what they want to do. And Whitney, actually Whitney and Jose, you both alluded to how in your process there are often points where story will be discussed. Changes to story, changes to plot points, or if not changes to plot points, changes to the way those plot points are portrayed on the page. And I guess what I'm curious about is, Whitney, if you could maybe kind of describe, how do you know when you're reading a comic that is taking shape and readable, and if not finished, close to completion, what are the signals to you that there's something that could change it for the better?
both Jose and I went to SCAD. So like I got a degree in sequential art. And so like kind of the similar experience that your students are going through, in which we had to bring pages, we had to bring scripts, we had to bring, and to have that critique. And honestly, it was one of those things where like, just to give like an origin story, like the critique process through college is probably what made me realize I wanted to be an editor, because I liked that whole process of like seeing a project come together and how can we all work together as a team to make the best version of the story. And like I was just as attached to what I worked on as I was to like other people's projects, and it was just like an interesting experience. But it's one of those things where like I think I've taken that kind of mentality with me as I've become an editor and started working with people on projects. And it's one of those things where when I'm reading a script, typically the thing I look out for, but a lot of it starts with a conversation with the author, where it's just like, hey, in particular, are they the ones who are drawing it, or is someone else drawing it? Because otherwise it's a conversation with both the author and the illustrator, or it's a conversation with the creator. And so it's one of those things being like, how many panels do you plan to have on a page? What audience is this for? Is this for a younger audience? Because then you probably can't have 10 panels a page. How long is this book? 300 pages? But you have like, every page has 10 panels a page. Like, this book is going to be impossible for you to draw. Are you ready for this? And things like that, where it's just like consideration for like just how comics are made, and having conversations with the creator to be like, what are you looking for? What are you hoping to achieve? And then taking that conversation, and whenever I'm going through each process, going like, okay, you are achieving what your goal is, or you're not achieving, and you're completely missing the point. Because there's sometimes where people are like, I have this high fantasy, but really this high fantasy is supposed to be and me exploring my personal relationship with my, dead relative. And then so like I'll be reading the story and I'm like, this is a fun fantasy adventure, but that exploration that you wanted to do is completely lost. And so we need to go back into the script and kind of figure out that pacing. I feel like a lot of my notes tend to be more heavy-handed earlier in the process. And a lot of that is like also in consideration for how long comics get made. Suncatcher is a specific situation in which the book was done and then I gave a whole bunch of notes. But typically my ideal format is like in the outline, scripting, thumbnail, pencils. Like that's where I'm going to be very heavy-handed, because usually by pencils you should have an idea of how everything's coming together, and then after that, like it'll be maybe some small tweaks, but it'll be a conversation each of the way where it's like, now that we have the book full together, should we add an extra page here just to slow down the pacing, because now that we have it all together we feel like it might be moving too fast? Or is it something where it's just like, now that we have everything lettered, I see that I have way too much dialogue, because the actions of the characters on the page actually show what I'm trying to get across, and I don't need to say it. I can just show it, which is one of the good things about comics, is that that's something you can do. And I feel like a lot of it ends up just being like a constant conversation. And it's not like there's always like a key warning sign, like a red flag, because every project is different and the way creators work is different, but it's more based off those conversations and based off of like my understanding for the process, but my understanding of how the creative process works. I can do my best to like catch those flags if they happen. And sometimes they don't have, like, I don't catch it in the outline, but I'll catch it in the script. Sometimes I might not catch it in the script, but once we get to like thumbnails, I'll be like, oh, okay, I see this pacing thing. Now we need to adjust this. And it's a constant conversation between me and the creator to make sure that we're making that, the best version of that project.
And then Jose, obviously you and Whitney have a very productive, efficient relationship. So I'm not sure if this question necessarily applies to that, but as a creator, how do you keep yourself open and flexible to receiving that kind of feedback?
I support everything that Whitney just said, and I will also say some of the things that a lot of cartoonists don't like to hear, which is like time management is a skill, and it's very, very important. I don't want to sound reductive or diminish anyone's struggles to keep that kind of to keep a schedule. But for instance, like kind of adding to what Whitney was saying, yes, by the time that Whitney and I started working on Suncatcher and like that the book was in the states that it was, I was very comfortable with having a conversation of like, when Whitney started suggesting additional pages, I knew how long those pages were going to take. I know when she asked me like, hey, can you add, just additional pages that were not going to be silent, that actually required dialogue, I had to take that into consideration of like, okay, well, that I'm going to have to script that, I'm going to have to thumbnail that, I'm going to have to send pencils. Like, how long does that take? And do I have that in the schedule, or do I have that on my schedule? Because life happens, or like some people, while they're working on their dream project, also have other employment, so on so forth. But I learned that lesson, the more I worked on comics as a whole and in graphic novels, because, for instance, and again, not to shed too much light on the project that Whitney and I are working on right now, because of our collaboration through Suncatcher, I was already very comfortable in telling Whitney how long it would take me to get this graphic novel done, knowing that it was going to be a little longer than Suncatcher. But at least I was able to sit down and have a conversation of well, in order to meet these deadlines, this is how I would need to work. But before I could say that with any confidence, I needed the experience of, Suncatcher took the time that it took, but that's also because, while I was writing it, I was working on other things. But also, once I bugged it down and just worked on that, I managed to just keep a track on myself. I'm realistically speaking, how many pages of this quality can I do a day? Realistically speaking, how long would it take me to write all this? And, and just keeping that, and being honest about that. And of course, the ambitious in me was to be 5 pages every day, Monday through Monday. As soon as I wake up, of course I want to say that because I want to impress people, because I want to be the best of this I can do. But realistically speaking, I have to say well, if I work 6 days a week with this pacing and with knowing my own style and knowing how much work I put into it, I can realistically do these amount of pages a day and still keep a healthy lifestyle without having to overstress myself, and pace myself and not be burned out by a certain point. All these things are very important, and I learned that lesson while I was working on the leg, which took longer than it could have, but also I had a day job at the time. The writer and I didn't have an editor at the time. We didn't have a publisher. We were just it was like a passion project back and forth. And then for my following book, I was given a specific deadline, and I just figured, okay, well, can I work with this? And to my own surprise, I was. And that kind of became my template of okay, well, if I do this amount of work, this amount of hours, for this amount of days, this is what I can realistically do. So by that definition, when Whitney and I started talking about not just Suncatcher, but for projects in the future, we could actually just be okay, well, how long do you need, and how quick of a turnaround would you need for this to do? And that's important for every cartoonist to recognize themselves into. Knowing your ambition is one thing, but knowing what you're capable of with sincerity, and it's also very important. Do you have the capacity to spend 9 hours or less than that or more than that a day for this amount of time in order to meet that deadline? And if the answer is no, then tell your editor. Let them know, and they will work with you, and because it's okay. You don't have to kill yourself. No one's expecting this from you. It's a matter of just knowing what you're capable of doing and giving yourself that, and giving yourself that parameter.
So I feel Jose, hearing you say all that, it sounds like you're sort of exactly describing the experience that Beatrice has in Suncatcher, that drive and that sort of ignoring friends and health to try to create this perfect song. I assume you didn't encounter the same sort of supernatural challenges that she did, but it's cool to hear you sort of really articulate what showed up in your creative work. It sounds to me if I'm hearing this correctly, though, both of you are sort of saying that there are times where creative decisions about the content of a book are made with that concrete kind of time management thing in mind. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel when time management is definitely important, just across the board. It's important for creators, it's important for editors, it's a big part of the job. But it's one of those things where I feel we all have a deadline that we're working towards. And granted, sometimes that deadline can move. Sometimes that I have instances where the deadline can move. I've had instances where the deadline cannot move. And it's one of those things where it's our job, it's our Jose's job as a creator, and it's my job as an editor to hit the deadlines we can make to make sure that we can get, on keep the book on time, keep the book coming out when stores and retailers and everyone are expecting the book to come out, but it's also our job to kind of plan for things, because you can't plan for life. You can't plan for a pandemic. You can't plan for a lot of things that are, that might just pop up. That you can try to plan for it ahead of time, being like, so this is the schedule. I'm going to give myself a little more time, because I'm going to understand that, like, I might get sick. I might need time off. I might be getting married. I might have a loved one pass away. There's so much stuff that could happen. And graphic novels also take so long to make that, like, a lot of people, I've had people who are like, well, I can draw 10 pages a week. So if this book is going to take me 2 years, then I'm going to, like, do the math to figure out, so I'm exactly 72 weeks in order to get this book done or whatever, and they'll, like, go through it all, and I'm sitting here going, like, but what about holidays? What about vacation? What about weekends? Like, are you putting all that in consideration? Sick days? And it's one of the, like, and I'm kind of, like, breaking it through, and I have had people who are like, I can get this graphic novel done in 6 months, and I'm like, here is your schedule that is a year and a half of me. So, triple the time frame you have given yourself, because in my experience, that's how long it's actually going to take you. And if you get it done sooner, awesome, we'll celebrate, it'll be cool. But, like, I also want to make sure that whenever I'm working with someone, that they're not killing themselves in the process in order to get something done, especially if they don't need to. For the most part, you should never need to.
Yeah, I think to my mind, comics are kind of unique. I mean, you two maybe you disagree, but I think you kind of know what I'm getting at here, where it's like the amount of time it takes an audience to read a comic is so disproportionate to the amount of labor it takes to make that comic. And that, I think, that creates this drive in a lot of comic creators to sort of do, Jose, what you were talking about wanting to do, like impress people with your speed and that commitment to quality. It's like, when you go see, like, it's like, I don't know, you go see, like, Avengers in the movie theater, you're like, yeah, that felt like it took thousands of people 2 years to make it, right? So then it's like, you sit down, in a couple of hours, you read Suncatcher, and it's like, a decade went by in just a couple hundred pages, so yeah, it's cool to hear both of those perspectives of, keeping that, the editor kind of keeping track and helping to set and calibrate those expectations, and then the creator sort of really figuring out how best to kind of work within some of those things. Jose, earlier on, you'd mentioned like fact checking and some copy editing and stuff, and I think that makes sense. But I guess my question is a little bit more for Whitney. When you're dealing with a book like Suncatcher, which is so, like, dense and rich in its specificity, like, Jose is not drawing a guitar. There are SGs, right? There are Gretsch guitars. There's the Stratocasters and stuff. There's the pedals. There's the posters. There's the locations in Mexico. Everything you've said, withstanding about the nature of the project kind of coming to you, sort of fully formed and a project that you were supportive of. Does that kind of writing, like writing with the image, does that present unique challenges to you as an editor, or do you have to think about that type of comic making differently?
I mean, I don't think I have to think about the comic itself differently, but I do think that it comes with its own unique challenges, and it's one of those things where it's like, I'm very lucky that, like, as I was going through it, I did my best to, like, Google and do research and to, like, look stuff up to make sure that as an editor, I'm, looking for all the facts. But then I'm lucky that at Penguin Random House, I actually have a copy editing department, in which part of their job is also to look at the details in the background and be like, is this accurate? There's a statue back here. What is that statue actually called? Like, things like that, where they sit there and then they come back to me, and, like, it was literally one of those things where, like, I remember my first pass of the book being like, I did such a great job. Like, they're going to have, like, there's going to be so little notes. I'm so excited. And it was literally like this just, like, Word doc of, like, all the questions. And I'm sitting here going, like, I am such, like, these people are professionals. This is what their job is dedicated to, and I am grateful for them. And but it provided its own unique challenges, because then it was just like, okay, let's take these questions to Jose, and me and Jose would go over them. And some of the stuff was just like, I believe there were even some notes where it was just like, there was no real answer. It was like, the possibility is it's either this or it's this, and it could be either way. And then it's one of those things where it could go either way, and it's one of those things where we just kind of had to make a decision, being like, are we going to go this way? Are we going to not go that way? So it should be fine. It came with its own unique challenges, but I think books having that. I don't think that. I know that's not the kind of the question, but it's like one of those things where like I don't think editors should be scared of books like that because I think they are fun challenges and they are something that readers also respond to because it's all these little things that they get to connect with, and it's all these little things where like there might be something that Jose put in the book, and then you looking in the back of the index where you're like going through finding all the Easter eggs, being like, this was what I thought it was, or you could be like, this is not what I thought it was, but it's something even better, and it just adds to the reader experience.
So, Jose, I'd love to know, did you learn anything through that fact-checking process? Was there stuff that you thought was right that was wrong or something like that?
No, I mean, like that was definitely one of the things that I was very nervous about when, if not the only thing that I was nervous about when Whitney requested to collaborate to bring Suncatcher into Penguin Random House, is that me sitting in my little corner of an office, in my apartment here in Glendale, California, I was like, I wasn't worried about, fair use for a very small print run for a book where I'm just throwing details just because I love Easter eggs and I love homages and I love noddings to every single thing as possible that has influenced me as a musician or like has influenced me as a cartoonist and why I love music and records and albums so much. So I wasn't worried about it at that point because I was also kind of figuring, well, who's going to see it? A little bit I know. Wendy Leopard is going to see it. And just kind of crank it up to 11. It was definitely that was one of the first questions that I asked Whitney. Is this going to be a concern when it comes to what is considered fair use, or are we going to have any issues in terms of licensing? Because this is not spoiler. Page 1, there is a quote by May He Rest in Peace, Kurt Cobain. That's the opening. So I thought I was being humorous by misspelling his name the way that he used to. No one needs to know that. Yeah, it definitely led to very good conversations about how to go about certain details, what couldn't be used, what was going to be used. And I mean, even with the Random House cover, where it's like there's a Stratocaster dead center. To this day, I kind of wonder, what do these guitar companies think about, like, having, their product, shown in this comic? Hopefully it's a positive thing. But yeah, I did learn a lot of spend more time doing research, because what you thought you knew was actually, not entirely correct, or maybe the way that you think about doing things may not, it's fine if you're just doing this amongst your friends, but maybe not if you're taking it to a bigger market. So yeah, I learned a lot, and it definitely did not reduce my passion for throwing Easter eggs wherever possible. That's something that I still like to do as much as I can. But it was also something that once we started having the conversations, I knew that it was a conversation that we were going to have, and that I wanted to learn more about, because hopefully in the future I could also just be more aware of, maybe this is something that I can not do, or maybe this is something that I shouldn't put there if I'm not 100% sure of what this means, and so on. So
I think maybe Jose talking about what they should not be doing is a great place to end our conversation today. Jose and Whitney, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, and for being so open and candid about experiences making Suncatcher, but also more broadly your experiences creatively and on the editorial side. I certainly learned a lot, and I think our listeners will as well.